Assalamu alaikum. Welcome to lecture number 35 for the subject of software design and architecture, iTech 4129. I am your course instructor Fahad Anwar. So students, before I start my today's lecture discussion, I would like to give you a little bit recap about our last lecture. So students, what we discussed in our last lecture. So students, if you remember, actually we are discussing the aspect oriented programming and other software reuse landscape we are discussing in this week. And in our last lecture I provide you some justifications why we are moving from functional programming towards the object oriented programming. And now from object oriented programming there are different kind of concerns are there. So I provide you some kind of justifications, arguments, and some foundations about why the our developers community is now thinking towards about aspect oriented programming to overcome the limitations which we are actually facing in object oriented programming, etc. So and then we discussed formally about what is actually aspect oriented programming, and we also discussed their little bit concepts. And now in this lecture we will discuss more in detail about aspect oriented programming. So student, it's a little bit recap about our lecture number 34. So let's formally start our today's lecture discussion. So students, in this lecture we will more comprehensively looks into detail for what is actually aspect oriented programming. We will see this concept in very detail, and then we will discuss some core concepts involved in the paradigm of aspect oriented programming. And in the whole lecture I will provide you some kind of justifications, you can say some kind of benefits, why the community is actually thinking to adopt this aspect oriented approach rather than object oriented programming, etc. I will provide you some kind of, you can say, benefits, justifications, or some kind of reasons why the currently developers community is actually thinking to moving towards aspect oriented approach, which is actually a software reusability approach, which actually provides a greater level of, you can say, modularity. And by allowing and this approach actually aims to increase modularity by allowing the separation of cross-cutting concerns. And now in this lecture, this is our objective which will be covered in this lecture number 35. So students, let's formally start our today's lecture discussion. So aspect oriented programming, as we discussed, and now we are going to discuss this paradigm in more detail, actually what behind the logic this programming language is. So as aspect oriented programming, you can say, is not a feature, it is basically just a model of programming itself, which and this paradigm aims to increase the modularity by allowing the separation of different cross cutting concerns as well. So what is actually aspect, you can say, some kind of particular part or feature of something is called aspect. And the next one is about concern, and what is actually the concern in aspect oriented programming. The term will be used again and again about the concern. So concern is actually, you can say, this aspect oriented approach actually break down the program logic into different distinct parts which we call concerns, and these concerns actually allows the programmer to handle these different concerns as separate single entity as well. So this is the notion behind aspect oriented programming as well. So aspect oriented programming, what is actually behind the main idea about aspect oriented programming is actually a new programming concept, which is not a, you can say, newly concept, is actually amendments or some amendment being made in object oriented programming. So the developers community shifting from object oriented to aspect oriented, but this approach is lax due to some kind of tools available as well. So the main this in this aspect oriented approach, actually the main purpose is to deal with the limitations being faced in object oriented programming. So this approach actually defines some kind of programming tools, however these look quite different from other available tools as well. So we can say our primary purpose for this programming approach is an aspect. And what is an aspect? As I discussed, aspect, you can say, a particular part or some feature of something across methods and class, are we call the concerns. So, in short, you can say that object-oriented programming actually deals with object, while in object-oriented programming is its main concern with aspects. And what is aspect? Any particular part or feature of something we call about aspect. So, like this aspect oriented programming, so we can say about this aspect oriented software design is basically students, it's an emerging software development technology because it was developed by in the late 90s and early 2000. So first released by the Aspect J, then it is used in mostly larger projects, and then different frameworks are being provided by the industrial community like Java Spring framework or Microsoft Transaction Servers are the two most prominent tools for this aspect oriented programming as well. And before I start this, this is basically an emerging software technology which actually aims to provide new modularization of our software systems in order to isolate secondary, or you can say supporting functions from the main program's business logic as well. So this aspect oriented approach is actually allows multiple concerns which can be expressed separately and automatically unified into working system is the main concern of aspect oriented programming, which actually breaks the logic into distinct parts as well, which we also call so-called concerns. So aspect oriented programming, we can say, is not a technology or product. It's basically some kind of programming paradigm which was actually derived from the object oriented programming by seeing their different limitations being faced in aspect in object oriented programming. The developers community introduced some new concepts which they called aspect oriented programming. So the main principle of this aspect oriented programming is also known as DRY. DRY means don't repeat yourself. You should be unique. So we can say the repeating thing, like there is the aspect or different cross-cutting concern. So in this approach, actually these aspects are extracted and then applied to target in a manageable and reusable approach to achieve the reusability and maintainability of this programming paradigm as well. So we can say our target of this aspect oriented approach is or focus on the identification, specification, and representation of cross-cutting concerns and their modularity into separate functional units. So we also focusing on as well as their automated composition into a working system are the main concerns of aspect oriented approach as well. So basically software modularity is actually provided by this, we can say, provided by this aspect oriented programming. So what are basically the aspects? So students, we can say aspect is a module which actually encapsulates a concern. And what is aspect and concern, I already have been discussed. I will call these two terms again. Aspect is basically a feature of something or a particular part of a program we called an aspect. And what is concern? In aspect oriented programming, we actually break down a program logic into distinct parts, and these parts we call the concerns. Now these two terms you should be clear about what is aspect and what is about concern. So after from the aspect and concern, we can say that basically aspect is a module which encapsulates a concern. So basically we can aspects are similar to class because they have a type, and they can also be extended classes like other aspects as well. We also see in this object oriented paradigm like these aspects can be abstract or concrete, and these things are also common in the classes as well. And then they also have some kind of data members, data methods, and their type of members, which we also call it data members as well. So these are the different things which are common among the classes and aspects, but these two are the similar but not the same. uh, uh, Object oriented limitations are actually being discussed or overcome in this aspect oriented approach. So we can say that aspects also contain classes and methods as well. So actually intertype declarations in the programming languages allow the programmer to modify a program structure like class members and class hierarchy as well. So new members can be inserted and classes can be pushed down the class hierarchy, etc. So students, I am assuming here that you are all of you are well aware about the object oriented programming. So these are the prerequisite course for software design and architecture programming fundamental, and object oriented programming are the prerequisite courses for this software design and architecture. So that's why I am not providing you the more details about the object oriented programming paradigms. I am supposing here that you are all of you are well aware about these terms. If any one of you are not clear about these terms, you should recall or polish your object oriented skills as well. So now we are discussing about aspects. So aspects, what actually are aspects? So aspect, as I said, is a common feature which typically you can say scattered across different methods, classes, objects, different hierarchies, or even in entire object model. So we can say, students, aspects are basically behavior that looks and, like, you can say it smells like it should have structure, but you cannot find a way to express this structure in code like with traditional object oriented techniques as well. So these aspects, if we see in more technical terms about these concepts of aspects, aspects are basically, if you see in the object A, object B, and object C, we have different kind of functionalities as well. And for all of these kind of aspects, as I discussed earlier, aspect oriented approach basically address different cross cutting concerns. So they provide better cross cutting processes than previous approaches. So these aspects help us to create cleaner code, and this code is reusable as a greater extent than as we see in object oriented approaches as well. So what are actually the logging, transaction, and configuration? So student, these are the different concerns which are these are the core concerns areas of aspect oriented programming. So these are the different, you can say about these are the different core concern areas of aspect oriented programming. So let's if I provide you more detail about these logging, transaction, and aspect. So if I talked about this, like cross-cutting concerns, like logging and transactions are part of every enterprise applications. So like sometimes they actually, we can say, obscure written code, taking more lines than actual business logic. So in addition, we can say like code reviewers, like designers, constantly struggle to ensure that developers don't miss these important aspects in their piece of code, like logging, transaction, we can say configuration. These are the important aspects which the programmer or software designers must consider, these kind of aspects in its application. So aspect oriented programming actually gives a configurable solution to different problems, which actually enhance the, we can say, overall readability and maintainability of the code while boosting teams productivity as well. So logging, transaction, configuration are actually different types of concerns which are the important areas of any aspect oriented languages. So for example, if I say about cross cutting concerns are actually a part of program which actually rely, or these concerns must affect many parts of the system as well. So these cross cutting concern is basically applicable throughout the application, like that it affect the entire application, we can say. So for example, logging, security, transaction, configuration, and different data transfers are the concerns which are needed in almost every module of an application. So hence they are our main cross-cutting concerns. So logging, transaction, configuration, security, data transfers are different aspect of any applications of in today's world. So what is the main difference between aspect and class? So students, there are aspects and classes are different because for the number of different reasons, like they actually include traditionally members like point cuts or advice. So what are the point cuts and advice? If I tell you about in the layman term what actually these two are. So if I talked about the advice, so advice is actually defines what needs to be applied and when we need to be applied. It is actually about advice. If I talked about the point cut, we can say point cut is a combination of different joint points where we need to apply these advices as well. So these point cuts and advice will be discussed in very comprehensively in the later part of this lecture as well. So and the next one is in aspects does not have a structure or finalizer, and they cannot be carried with new operator. So this is also a major difference between the aspect and class. And another one is aspect actually privilege the aspects can access private members of other types, which the classes in the class we cannot achieve the private member in other classes as well. Only the protected members can be achieved in the derived class. So in the aspects, different privileges can access through private members of other types as well. So these are the different differences between aspects and classes. So here are the students, now we are discussing the core concepts of aspect oriented programming. So what are the basically core concepts of aspect oriented programming? So before I start these different core areas of aspect oriented programming, so basically this aspect oriented approach allows us students like global properties of a program to decide how it is compiled into an executable program. So we can say the key idea of modularity is an aspect instead of a class. So this aspect oriented programming actually breaks down the logic of the program into various parts which we known as concerns. So different cross-cutting concerns can affect the entire application, and it is mostly centralized in one location. So in code like transaction, security management, logging, authentications are different cross-cutting concerns in today's modern applications, etc. So let's students discuss the different core areas of aspect oriented programming in more detail. So so first of all, what is aspect? We already have been discussed in very detail. Aspect is an aspect is basically a class which actually we can say aspect, as we discussed earlier, is basically our, so basically aspect, as we discussed earlier, aspect is basically a module which encapsulates any concern. So if we say about aspect is about how different concerns can be achieved. Like if we talked about in aspect oriented programming, these aspects are really important. Like these aspects are mostly utilizes across different cross-cutting concerns like logging, security, and these are the different important terminologies which actually being used in this aspect oriented programming as well. So let's we start our discussion towards the core areas of this aspect oriented programming. So the student, these are the different core areas of aspect oriented programming. So I will provide you details about these one by one. So first of all, if we say about this aspect oriented approach, okay, why we need different aspect oriented areas to actually provide a framework for aspect oriented paradigms. So here are the different approaches towards aspect oriented core areas. So the first one is about aspect. So what is aspect? We already have been discussed in very detail. And after aspect is about the join point. So we can say this join point is basically a candidate point in the program execution where an aspect can be plugged in. So it could be a method being called as an exception being thrown, so or even a field which is actually modified. So if I talked about the advice, so these advice are the actual actions which actually taken for a specific join point. And the next one is point cut. It is basically an expression which can like be matched within join points to check what are like that advice should be executed or not. And the next one is target object. So what is target object? Basically student, this target object is based on the object devices being applied. So in object oriented programming, a subclass is created at runtime where the target method should be overridden. So and this advice are included depending on their configuration, etc. And the next concept is proxy. Basically proxy is object should be created after applying the advice to the target object, etc. And the next one is about weaving. So what is weaving? Is a method of linking an aspect with other applications of objects or types to be built and advised objects. So we can say weaving is a method of linking an aspect with other applications object as well. So this is the little bit overview about different core areas about aspect oriented programming. So here I will provide you more details about what are the different core of aspect oriented programming. So students, in this aspect oriented programming, basically we can say, if you see in this diagram, aspects are basically as we discussed are module, which is a set, basically aspect is basically a module like which has a set of different API providing cross-cutting requirements. For example, I say a logging module would be called aspect oriented programming aspect for logging. So an application can have any number of aspects depending on their requirements. So if we see in the about the advice, so what is actually advice? This advice, if I tell in more layman term, advice is actually defines what needs to be applied and when it need to be applied is actually about the advice. So the next one is about like we can also say the advice is actually action to be taken either before or after the method of execution. There are different types of advices we also discussed in later part. And the next one is about point cut. So point cut, we can say, is a set of one or more joint points where an advice should be executed. It's our join points. And what are the point cuts? So if we talk about different point cuts, so students, these point cuts are basically, we can say, a point cut is a set of join points. Look, whenever I say the program execution reach one of the join points, it actually described in the point cut like a piece of code associated with the point cut called advice, which is executed. So this point cut actually allows a programmer to describe where and when additional code should be executed in addition to an already defined behavior. So these are the different core aspect oriented programming concept. So basically this is the Spring framework of aspect oriented programming, which we also discussed in more detail in our common lecture. The aspect oriented framework, very famous one. First one was the aspect J and the second one is about Spring framework. And now here are the core concepts about different aspect oriented programming terms for your better understandability what actually they are mean. So I provided you here a little bit description about all of these concerns or concepts. Like aspect, we already have been discussed in more detail. Like as I said earlier, aspect is basically a something or some part of feature is being provided, we call aspect, or some point of view you can say is aspect as well. So what are the join points? If I say you about the join points, so these join points actually, we can say, is where the advice is actually applied. So what is advice? We will see different types of advice in later part as well. So basically join point shows a point in your actual applications where you can plug in aspect oriented aspects as well. So you can also say that it is the basically actual place in your under developing applications where different actions can be taken using this aspect oriented framework. So Spring aspect oriented programming is basically a tool for aspect oriented programming, where Spring Framework is also a very famous framework being utilized for aspect oriented programming tasks. I will also provide you some foundation ideas behind Spring Framework, actually what they are. So till here you just need to know about Spring Framework are basically a tool which actually supports or provides the utilities for aspect oriented programming. And the next concept is about weaving. So weaving, as I said earlier, in weaving actually provide us a way to link the process of is a process of linking different kind of aspects with other application objects, etc. So this type of weaving is actually done at compile time, load time, or you can say at runtime as well. So the next one is about advice. As we discussed earlier, advice, actually what is advice? So advice is actually defines what needs to be applied and when it need to be applied. So if there are different types of advices are available, so before I start the different advices, I would like to say about these advices basically is an actual piece of code which invoked during the program execution by Spring Aspect Oriented Programming Framework. So Spring Framework is actually a tool, or you can say supporting framework being provided by the developers community, which actually supports aspect oriented approach as well. So students, there are different types of advices available for this, like before, after. So I will discuss one by one. So before advice is actually this advice is run before the before a method is actually executed. And after advice, this after advice is actually run after the method execution regardless of its outcome. And after returning is actually what this after returning, actually we run this advice after that a method execution only if methods completes successfully. So another aspect is after throwing. So after throwing advice we actually run after a method execution only if method exists by throwing an exception. So what is exception handling? Exception handling is basically you already have been you already have been studied in oriented programming approach about exception handling, where we use different try and catch blocks. So I don't need to give you details about what is actually exception handling. So I am assuming here you are well aware about exception handling. So another last advice is about around. So we usually run this around advice before and after the advised method is actually invoked. So these are five other different types of devices are available in the Spring framework. So the last point is about point cuts. So students, what are actually the point cut? So point cut, you can say that is basically a combination of different join points where advice needs to be applied. So we can also say it is a set of one or more join points where actual device should be executed. So you can say it actually specified point cuts using expressions, or you can say patterns, as we will see in our aspect oriented different examples in later lectures as well. What are the different examples, patterns, or expressions you can specify with the help of different point cuts using expressions, patterns as well. So students, these are the different core areas of aspect oriented programming, different terminology you can say which we have been discussed in this lecture. So student, these are the different terms we have been discussed. We see what are this the actual aspect oriented approach, where we discussed about what are the aspects concerns. Then we discussed about different aspects like logging, like transaction, like configuration, data transfer, security. These are the different aspects which are basically a part of today's modern world, any application. And then we see the main differences among aspects and classes as well. And then we discuss some core concepts of aspect oriented programming, where we discussed about join points, weaving, aspects, point cuts, advice, and we also discussed different types of advices as well, students. So students, till here our lecture number 35 is ended.